What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen and I am back with another true crime video. And today we are going to be looking into the abduction and the solved murder of 9-year-old Jessica Lunsford. This case was known by the entire country. It actually even went international. And majority of people to this day will probably still recognize the photo that circulated relentlessly in 2005 when she went missing. The horrors that this little girl had to experience and endure are absolutely devastating, but the investigators and her family have since made very drastic efforts in an attempt to change laws in regards to sex offenders in almost every single state. So a lot of the different laws that you're currently seeing where you live right now probably have changed so much directly because of this particular case. Before I speak on today's case, I want to say a huge thank you to Care Of. Care Of is a subscription supplement service that I've personally been using for years now. I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about it. It's made it really easy for me to stick to a routine because choosing supplements can be very overwhelming, especially when you have no idea what supplements are going to support you best. And Care Of made that incredibly simple. They have a very quick quiz that you can take on your website, and they will provide you a personalized list of supplements. And then you will receive these daily vitamin packs. So everything you need is in this one easy pack. And on top of that, these packs are actually made out of compostable film. So I also throw these into my compost pile, which is like a huge plus for me and my earth-loving self. Now, with the holidays coming up, things get that much more chaotic for me, and unfortunately, between working and visiting family and travel and all the errands I have to run, it becomes very difficult for me to stay on top of my health. It can very easily get put to the back burner. So thankfully, with these little packets, I'm able to keep the entire container of them on my work desk, and because it's pretty colors and it's very aesthetically pleasing, I'm able to be like, oh wow, that's cute, what's that? And I remember to take my vitamins every single morning. Plus, they get delivered right to my door, so I don't have to add any trips to my already very long list. I may still eat a lot of candy and possibly a lot of pie, but at the very least, I'm taking my vitamin C. So, it's something. I've seen a lot of great benefits from taking Care Of. I've been able to retake my quiz when I need to, when my lifestyle changes. I've seen a lot of help from the probiotic blend when it comes to gut health, and also the fish oil is shellfish free, which is really great for your heart. So if you are looking for a little assistance when it comes to taking care of your body and maintaining your health this holiday season, you can take Care Of's quiz and find out your personal supplement recommendations. And not just that, you can use my code Danielle50 for 50% off your first order. Thank you again to Care Of for partnering with me on today's video. It is brands like Care Of that first of all allow me to take care of myself, which is something that I can struggle with sometimes. And on top of that, they allow me to do what I do and support these families as much as I possibly can. This is the season for doing for others, but do not forget to take care of yourself along the way. Now into today's video. So Jessica, who went by Jessie, was born on October the 6th, 1995 to Mark and Angela Lunsford. Now, by the time she was just a year old, her parents decided the best decision for them was to split up, and ultimately it seemed that Jessie would stay with Mark. Angela moved to Ohio, where she eventually got remarried and had a son, and Mark and Jessie moved into a little mobile home off of Sonata Avenue in Homosassa, Florida, and they moved in with Jessie's grandparents, Ruth and Archie. Now, Mark figured this was going to be a very mutually beneficial situation. His parents were aging at this point, so he figured that he could help them out whenever they needed it, and they also could help him with Jessie because he worked very, very long hours. He was a dump truck driver. We're talking 15 to 20 hour shifts sometimes. And so instead of having to pay for childcare, she could be with family members that loved her in the comfort of her own home. And this seemed to work out beautifully. Jessie was thriving as a child. I feel like there was never a time in any of the pictures that I have seen, candid or not, where she did not have the biggest smile on her face. She was full of life. She was full of personality with a huge curiosity for everything around her. She absolutely loved to sing. She loved to spend time with her family. She loved to play with her stuffed animals. Those were probably her most prized possessions. She had a little dog named Corky that she loved and adored, but probably her favorite thing to do was go on motorcycle rides with her dad because her dad was her favorite person. Mark was Jesse's hero. Jessie was always a great student as well. She got very good grades. She had a lot of really good friends. And she was also very active in the local church that she went to with the rest of her family. According to Ruth, her grandmother, she had very big plans when she grew up. While she could never really say 100% at any point in time what she wanted to do, depending on the day, she usually said that she wanted to be either a fashion designer or an Olympic swimmer. So this girl was shooting for the absolute stars. But on February 23rd into the 24th, the entire Lunsford family had their lives turned upside down. And Jessie, this little girl filled with love and light, with such a bright future, had all of that opportunity stripped away from her by the hands of an absolute monster. February 23rd, 2005 started off as any average day for Jessie. She went to school that day, Ruth picked her up and they ran a few errands, and then since it was Wednesday, she went to church with a family friend named Sharon Armstrong. This was a routine she had every single Wednesday like clockwork, and after church, Sharon would then tutor Jessie, and this particular day they were working on their sign language. And at around 9 p.m., once they decided, enough is enough, Sharon dropped Jessie back off at her home, and she remembers as Jessie reached the door to go inside, she turned for a moment, signed to Sharon, "I love you," and then went into the home. And this is something that Sharon has said she will never ever forget because it was the last time that she personally ever saw Jessie Lunsford. Now, shortly after Jessie arrived home, Mark got home from a very long 15-hour shift. And so it seems that they took advantage to whatever time they had together since he worked such sporadic and long hours. And so they decided to hang out on the couch, watch some TV for a while. Before putting Jessie to bed, she was just goofing around, jumping around on the couch, according to Mark. And finally, at about 10 p.m., Ruth decided, all right, enough's enough. It's time to turn in. And she took Jessie off to bed. This was one of their rituals that they had together that they had done for as long as either of them could remember. Jessie dressed in her favorite pink nightgown. Ruth tucked her into bed. They said their prayers. She kissed her goodnight, turned off the light, and everyone turned in for the night. Now, Mark was actually not staying at the home this night. He had a girlfriend that he was seeing at the time, and so once he knew that Jessie was in bed and settled for the night, he headed off to spend the night at his girlfriend's house with plans to return early the following morning to get ready for yet another shift and to also ensure that Jessie was up and getting ready for school. So it was about 6 a.m. the following morning of February 24th, 2005, when Mark returned back to the home. Now, when he arrived, he heard Jessie's alarm going off, but he figured she was just being slow at waking up. She'd eventually, be up and moving around. So he went to his room, got himself ready real quick, and noticed when he was done that he still heard Jessie's alarm going off. And at this point, there was no reason for that to be happening. So he decided to go and check her room to hopefully wake her up, be like, hey, stop ignoring your alarm clock. But when he opened the door, Jessie wasn't there. The entire rest of the room appeared completely undisturbed, as if she had simply poof vanished from her bed. Her outfit that had been laid out for her for school that day was still neatly folded and waiting for her over to the side. There wasn't anything obvious that seemed to be missing other than obviously Jessie. There wasn't anything that seemed to be thrown around. Even when he arrived to the home, there wasn't anything to him that really threw him off. So it really did seem that the only things that were missing were Jessie, the pink nightgowns she had last been seen in, and they also noticed that her favorite purple stuffed dolphin that her father had just won for her at the fair was missing along with her. Right away, Mark ran to his mother's room and said, look, Jessie's missing. I looked in her room. I can't find her anywhere. And according to Ruth, she never heard anything strange the night before. They could not figure out where Jessie possibly could have gone. They did a very quick search together throughout the home to see if maybe they had just somehow missed her somewhere, but sure enough, there was nothing. However, the one thing that Ruth noticed was that there was a pretty large cut in the screen door that led into the home. And I've even seen, according to some reports, that they had noticed that the front door was unlocked. Their heads at this point were spinning with possibilities because Jessie was incredibly afraid of the dark. She, from what I have seen, would not even go to sleep without a nightlight or a flashlight, so there was no way that she was going to get up in the middle of the night in her pajamas with her stuffed animal and wander off into the darkness. And even then, it was like, what would she have ever wandered off into the darkness for? She was safe. She knew she was loved. She was comfortable in her home. This was not a runaway situation. They knew that there had to be something more to this. So right away, they called 911 and reported Jessie as missing. Mark at this point was frantic, and so he jumped into his car and immediately started making rounds on all of the neighborhood roads with his windows down, screaming Jessie's name at the top of his lungs, hoping that somehow, some way, all of this was just a misunderstanding. But ultimately, Mark was never able to locate Jessie or any sign of her. And so at this point, back at the house, Sheriff Deputy Juan Santiago was the first to arrive from Citrus County Sheriff's Office, who was the investigating agency in this particular case. Now, Ruth, thankfully, and this is the first time I have ever seen this in any of the cases that I have ever covered, and Ruth had a set of Jessie's fingerprints. She had this done for an if I go missing kind of, file for Jessie, which is something that is nowhere near as common as it should be. And so she was able to hand these fingerprints over to the authorities and give them a quick rundown of events. And this alone probably put them leaps and bounds ahead of so many other cases. And while having that evidence may not always lead to direct, concrete answers, it could give you a better idea of what is going on. And so being able to have those fingerprints to test against, potential places that Jessie may have been or gone to was definitely already setting them up for hopefully being able to go on the right track. Right after taking all of this information, Sheriff's Deputy Juan Santiago did a very quick search around the house before ultimately calling for backup. At this point, Sheriff's deputies started to pour into the area, and they would remain there for the following month, nonstop. Thankfully, this is not one of those cases where everyone kind of drags their feet. Right away, people were out searching for Jessie. They had officers searching on foot in all of the surrounding area. From the way I've seen it described at the time, it's a lot more built up in this area, but back when this occurred, it was very, very wooded around their home. Lots of different places for a child to potentially walk off and get lost or trapped in the brush. Helicopters also came in to help search from above, just in case people were missing something or, to help guide them in a direction that it looked like someone may have gone. They also brought out scent dogs to try to pick up some sort of answer and, direction that Jessie may have gone in when she left the home. And this still wasn't even all of the efforts that were put in pretty much right away. Dive teams were sent to all of the different bodies of water in the area. This is Florida. There were a lot of them. And obviously with the different threats of predators and things along those lines, they wanted to make sure if she was in any body of water or anywhere around there, she was found as quickly as possible. They also brought out searchers on horseback to try to cover ground quicker. So all efforts possible were put into trying to locate Jessie as soon as they possibly could. That same day, February 24th, Detective Holder processed the Lunsford home to try and get any evidence as to what may have happened. And he also immediately noticed the same tear or cut in the screen on the front entrance door of the house as Ruth had. It was a 6-inch L-shaped cut, and it was right by the door handle. And so in my mind, my first thought would be someone absolutely cut that to be able to reach in from the outside and unlock the door. But it seems at this point, police didn't really want to settle on whether they believed this was a runaway or an abduction. So despite finding this, it kind of stayed neutral in terms of leading the investigation. CSI Tech Brian Spittle also joined in, taking photographs of the home and vacuuming the entire home, hoping to possibly pick up any evidence that may have been left behind. And it seemed that they initially kind of set their eyes on the Lunsford family. They decided to check Mark's route for when he was working with the dump truck, to check all of the different locations that he had stopped at. And they physically went there and searched these areas, from my understanding. And this was to basically rule out that he wasn't somehow involved in his daughter's disappearance and used his dump truck to get rid of her. And this was something that was incredibly difficult for the family to go through, because they all had done absolutely nothing but spend Jesse's entire life supporting her, making the best decisions for her, raising her to be the best young girl she could possibly be. And so to see that they were kind of at the center of this investigation was heartbreaking for them. But so far, there really hadn't been any evidence to show the sheriff's department a very clear way to go. And so statistically, since parents or someone that knows the child is the one behind an abduction, obviously they did have to rule the family out first. But the Lunsford family knew they had absolutely nothing to do with this and knew that this was not a runaway situation. Someone had to have taken her, but they had no idea who possibly could have done that. Now, at this point, the Citrus County Sheriff's Department, I think, realized that this was something a little bit bigger than they had ever dealt with before. This was not your run-of-the-mill investigation. I feel like when we talk about these cases on my channel, it starts to feel as if like this is all that's ever happening in any town across the United States of America and across the world. But the reality is that there are still a lot of towns where situations like this have only come up once, maybe. So a lot of these different agencies who have this happen, they immediately feel like they are in over their heads. And so thankfully, Citrus County kind of realized that, and within days was able to bring on the FBI and NCMEC to help join in on the efforts. And they were able to help out a lot with their different resources. So at this point, they plastered Jesse's face across every single television in the United States of America. This photo of Jessie and this fuzzy pink bucket hat, along with all of the details that they knew of her disappearance, hoping that someone somewhere had some sort of information, and so tips began to pour in. Information about Jessie was also on America's Most Wanted a handful of times, and even the U.S. Postal Service stepped up to start putting Deliver Me Home flyers into the mailbox of, I believe they did over 100,000 homes in the area, just furthering the reach of Jessie's face. They wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that she was missing, so that there was no chance of a missed tip or lead that could put them in the right direction. Not only were all of these different agencies and offices working together to hopefully bring Jessie back home, but the community also immediately mobilized. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. It was absolutely fantastic to see so many people come forward and be so caring to dedicate as much time as they possibly could, all for the cause of bringing this little girl home. Everyone from neighbors to organizations, local businesses, I mean, pretty much anyone who had the chance to lend a hand was doing just that. Volunteers were gathering by the hundreds, you guys. That is such a big number, by the hundreds, at Faith Baptist every single morning, where Jessica had attended church, and they would make a game plan, split up into different groups, and they would search massive areas at a time. And probably another really cool thing about this case is that it seems that the volunteers and the police and the FBI were all working hand in hand. Like, this wasn't a situation where everyone was like pushing against each other, and you know, it seemed everyone's goals were kind of like completely different places. Everyone had the same hope. Everyone was in this together. But unfortunately, every single search seemed to turn up absolutely nothing, despite the massive amounts of effort being put forward. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey ended up coming forward and said, quote, "I have some grave concerns about the welfare of this child. We're working something that is a step up from a missing person." But despite saying that, the sheriff's department didn't seem to be really giving forward any other information, so no one was still quite sure what exactly that meant. So as the publicity grew in this case, so did the questions, but right along with that, the generosity of everyone that knew Jessie, and even just pure strangers. Mike Hamilton, who had been an Atlanta Braves pitcher, actually lived in the area at the time, and his son was in the exact same class as Jessie. And not just that, their birthdays were only a day apart. So this hit him in a way that he had never expected, and he wanted to be able to help out as much as possible. So he offered up a $25,000 reward for Jessie's safe return. And This started a domino effect. One by one, donations started to come in, and the reward kept growing until it eventually reached $115,000. And I feel like there's just no way to really show how much went into the search for Jesse and the efforts put forth by everyone, and especially the short period of time that all of this happened in. All of this had happened in maybe like a week, maybe a week and a couple of days, like everything that I just explained. And that's so mind-boggling to me after covering so many cases where it's like a year for some cases to even get to this point. According to Sheriff Jeff Dawsey, he said, quote, "This was national, international, it had a life of its own." And Melissa Bowermaster, who was the lead for the victims advocate team for Sheriff Jeff Dawsey, said, quote, "She became everyone's daughter. She became everyone's friend. Everybody felt so helpless and so hurt, they just wanted to do whatever they could." Now, the media was absolutely latched onto the story. They were constantly outside of the Lunsfords' home waiting for any information they could get, likely because there was a 24-hour command center that the sheriff's department had set up right out front of the home. And despite the fact that the sheriff's office had yet to publicly state that this was an abduction at this point, Mark made several pleas to whoever took his daughter because that was the only theory that he believed at all. He said, quote, "I don't care who you are. Drop her off at the corner. Call me. I'll come get her. She belongs at home." And finally, on February 27th, 2005, there was the first bit of hope. In the midst of all of the searches and investigating, police had found a photo, so they released it. This photograph was a man with two young children, and it was captured on surveillance. I'm not exactly sure where. I just know that it was in the area, and it was taken hours after Jesse had vanished. So they believed it was very possible, obviously, at this point, that she had in fact been abducted and was with some strange man and another child. Now, the entire country at this point is on the very edges of their seat because they're hoping that this is the break that everyone had been waiting for. Like, this is the thing that's going to bring Jesse home, but the Lunsfords already knew that this was just completely false hope. They had seen this photograph before it was released publicly, and they knew for a fact neither of those children were Jesse. But the sheriff's department released it anyway, hoping that it would still help bring forward tips. But that's not at all what happened. The man in the photo saw himself being plastered all over the news and immediately came into the sheriff's department to have himself ruled out. He explained that he had nothing to do with Jesse's disappearance, that he was clearly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was able to hand over all of the information to prove this, about where he was, why he was there, the children that were with him. And so ultimately he ended up being ruled out, and this final bit of hope very quickly was extinguished. And so Sheriff's Department was back to square one, and boots were back on the ground. February 28th, the following day, hundreds upon hundreds of volunteers and deputies yet again began the search for Jesse. And this time, they were so dedicated to find answers that they searched a state park for hours and torrential downpours and tornado watches. They were refusing to give up. But despite continuing these searches and questionable elements, March came and Citrus County Sheriff's Department had to face a very harsh reality. They had searched miles and miles of land. They had used helicopters and dogs and volunteers. So many people had their eyes on the ground looking for Jesse. Thick woods, state parks, bodies of water, and they had come up with absolutely nothing. Whatever they were doing at this time, despite all of the efforts going into it, was not producing any answers. And so they needed to regroup. Citrus County Police Department called off all of the main large searches and brought in specialized search experts, hoping that with less numbers, with more experienced people, highly trained dogs, and smaller, more focused areas, they would have hopefully a higher degree of accuracy, or at least find, something. So they focused on the quarter-mile area around Jesse's home. And it didn't end up being these focused searches that actually brought forward any answers. So while those searches were going on, it did allow the Sheriff's Department a little bit more room to dig deeper into investigating and finding out possible persons of interest that they could look into. And this led them to a very typical thing that is done during times like this, where one of the first things you check are the registered sex offenders in the area. Now, there were 208 total sex offenders in Citrus County, with 50 of those being within like the zip codes directly surrounding Jesse's home. So they had 50 people to immediately start with, and this led them to a name. Now, I have not personally seen how exactly they found this one name out of all of them, but I feel like I have enough common sense to kind of figure out how. So what I'm about to say next, I don't know for sure this is what happened. It's just what makes most sense to me. But typically when we have a situation like this, when the sheriff's department or the police department is looking into registered sex offenders in regards to a case, one of the first things they do is go door to door. They're meeting with every single one of these individuals to question them and figure out if there's any possibility they could be involved. But this man, the name that they had, they went to his registered address and he didn't live there anymore. So that automatically raises a red flag. When they look deeper into it, I'm sure that they found that his sister lived within 65 yards of Jesse Lunsford's home. When they continued to dig into this man, they kept on running into just very questionable and convenient things. So police announced that this man that they were searching for, they had not yet named, had left town entirely within 11 days of Jesse's disappearance. And so they openly stated that this man knew exactly who he was, and he had 48 hours to return to Citrus County for questioning, or they were going to release his name and his photograph and basically be on the hunt for him. They were hoping that by doing this, him knowing he, had certain requirements as a registered sex offender, it would scare him into coming back, but he didn't. This man did not come back. So police began to state publicly that they were looking for 46-year-old John Evander Couey. Now, Couey, as I stated like a million times already at this point, was a registered sex offender, and it was apparently repeat convictions of sexually assaulting children. So this put him obviously at the very top of their potential suspect list. And on top of that, he just had a massive criminal record in general. I believe he was arrested 24 times in 30 years, and his arrest started at the age of 18 or 19 years old. And it was a very wide array of crimes. It was usually things like burglary, carrying a concealed weapon. He had a lot of charges eventually for driving under the influence, disorderly intoxication, and eventually he ended up having his license suspended for 99 years. So basically he could never drive a car ever again because of how many times he had been in a car while intoxicated. Around this time, it is said that he also fell into heavy drug use and became heavily addicted to cocaine. And this is when things seemed to spiral and his crimes began to directly target other people. So in 1978, he had faced charges of breaking into a home, and during the burglary, he went to one of the rooms and there was a young child in there, and he proceeded to sexually assault this child. I've also seen that he exposed himself to a 5-year-old, and there are plenty of testimonies from other family members of him, his and friends of his, that have stated very similar occurrences. There had just never been any charges or convictions for them. So just a whole lot of very, very terrible things. So obviously, with this possibility that he could have been across the street from Jesse Lunsford's home with his sister, Dorothy Dixon, you can understand why police wanted to speak to him. And the fact that he had all of a sudden dropped off the map just within days of Jesse's disappearance was definitely something a little bit suspicious. So they decided to draft up a nationwide warrant for his arrest. And it wasn't in connection to the disappearance of Jesse Lunsford. It was actually for probation violations stemming from his failure to report a change in address. There were some drug charges that he had to answer to. And so they were hoping this would capture him and at least get him in a secure location so they could go and question him. Now, within 24 hours, on March 12th, Savannah police did end up locating Couey. At this point, I don't believe that the warrant had fully gone out yet, but his face was still plastered all over the television. And so ultimately, on March 12th, Savannah police ended up locating Couey. So there was a receptionist at the Salvation Army in Savannah, one of their locations, that had seen him on television and also saw him at the Salvation Army. So she called into Savannah police and reported this, and they were able to go and snag him up. Now, obviously, at this point, investigators are already in contact with the FBI and Citrus County Sheriff's Department, and they essentially tell them to question him about the crime because they don't have any solid evidence at this point fully connecting him. They just need to question him. And so this is what Couey tells Detective Love. So he did confirm that he had been living at the home right across the street from Jessie Lunsford, but he claimed that he knew absolutely nothing about this missing girl. He didn't know her, and that the only thing he knew was that he had seen her face on the news. But despite claiming that he lived in the exact same neighborhood as Jessie, he then went on to say that the only time he was ever in that neighborhood was to pick up trailer parts. So you can see that his statements are already a little bit funny. But because he was adamant that he had absolutely nothing to do with this and they were still trying to gather evidence back home, they had no option but to release him. The following day, on March 13th, Detective Love wanted to try again. They basically wanted to keep on bringing him in until hopefully he confessed, or, they were able to successfully get the warrant and take him back to Florida. They were just trying to make sure they had tabs on him at all times. So on March 13th, he was questioned a second time by Detective Love, and he essentially said the exact same thing, that he lived in Homosassa with his family before moving to Georgia, but this time he claimed that he moved to Georgia to get a job, basically, and that was the only reason he left, and there was nothing at all suspicious about it. And he even confirmed that he had been in contact with his sister since he arrived in Georgia, which kind of comes into play a little bit later. But he still was very clear that he did not know anything about Jessie Lunsford or her abduction, and even said that he wasn't in the habit of, quote, snatching up kids, and so again, they had no choice but to release him. By the following day, February 14th, the one time that it probably would have been very, very important to go and find him, they were unable to. Detective Love did want to try for a third interview, but Couey was nowhere to be found, and so it was assumed that he was on the run yet again. Back in Homosassa, sheriff's deputies ended up at the home of Dorothy Dixon, where he had already stated that he had been living prior to leaving for Georgia, which he said at the time was on March 10th. Now, Dorothy Dixon, who was his sister, lived in a trailer off of Snowbird, which again was, according to documents, 65 yards away from the Lunsford home. And when authorities arrived, she gave them permission to check Couey's room, which was the middle room in the trailer, as well as the surrounding area, and she was able to confirm that he had been living there at the time of Jessie's abduction/disappearance. So Detective Martin Canaday began to process the trailer and take multiple items from the home, and also Dorothy Dixon's car was taken in for forensic testing as well. Now, it was noticed pretty much right away upon walking into Couey's room that his mattress had very large and multiple bloodstains on it. And there were also a handful of pillows in the room, I think 2 blue ones and a green one, that also had sizable amounts of bloodstains on them. And so all of these items were taken in for forensic testing. And they also decided to grab a few items on the floor that appeared to be Couey's clothing, potentially get a DNA profile and a handful of other things, because suspicious things were really starting to add up about Couey and his possible involvement. And one kind of random thing that had happened about a week after her disappearance is that Tex Spittle had photographed the different views you could see from the Lunsford home on March 2nd. And he actually took a photograph of the home that Couey lived at, and you could see that there was a ladder, clear shot from the Lunsford home. There was a ladder leaning up against one of the windows into one of the bedrooms, but at the time they weren't sure where exactly this ladder was going to, whose bedroom, but they were able to confirm at this point that it was a ladder going straight into Couey's room. So this was just another thing that was a little bit odd, because why would he need that? Now, by the following day of March 15th, Detective Gary Atchison was able to successfully locate Couey. He had, in fact, left Savannah and was now in Augusta, Georgia. By the 17th, Citrus County deputies headed that way to interview Couey themselves, that they managed to be able to bring into custody in Augusta. Now, Detective Atchison and Detective Scott Grave were the ones that conducted the interview. And so this would be his technically third interview that he'd had at this point. And at this time, he claimed that he arrived in Georgia on the 7th of March. So we have a date change here, which I think that is actually the confirmed day that he left and arrived in Georgia. And he said this time that he actually left because his sister had kicked him out. He had no choice but to leave, and so he figured he would go back to Georgia. But he still was denying any knowledge in regards to the abduction of Jesse. But he did seem to be giving like a little bit more information. He started to say that while he'd never seen her before, there is a chance that he had possibly seen her by glance. He mentioned that the kids would often run a lot in the neighborhood and would run up through their front yard, so maybe he had seen her, but that's all that he knew of her. When detectives directly asked him at this point about the ladder that had been seen going directly into his bedroom, he was able to explain this away as well. He claimed that there was a TV antenna that he had decided to put onto the roof of the house, and so that is what he needed that ladder for. I don't know if that was something that was ever confirmed or not. I do know that they asked Dorothy about that, and she was never aware that he put an antenna on her house. But regardless, he explained that away. He also explained away the blood that had been found on his mattress. He told authorities that he had actually purchased that mattress from someone else, and that is the way that it came with these blood stains on it. And he said, you might find a few bits of my blood, but that's all you're going to find. And lastly, police asked him where he was when they went to the home 2 separate times. They went to the home on the 24th and they also went on the 25th. And he specifically said that on the 25th, he was there when detectives came to search the home, but he had stepped out back and he ended up not speaking to anyone. So at this point, they're like, okay, he's, brushing everything off, but we definitely feel like this man has something to do with this abduction. And so at this point, they had the FBI administer a polygraph. He did agree to, he did take, but after finishing it, Couey said, quote, "You don't need to tell me the results. I already know what they are. Could I have the investigators come back in?" And when investigators came back in, he immediately confessed to abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering Jesse Lunsford and apologized for wasting everyone's time. Now, the details that he revealed were so upsetting and infuriating because she had been right there the entire time. Couey told investigators that at around 3 a.m. on February 24th, he went into the Lunsford home with all intentions of just burglary. Like he was just going to go in, burglarize the home, and leave. But he ended up seeing Jesse and acted on impulse and took her. He woke her up, told her to be quiet, and apparently led her out of the house and into his room through his window where that ladder was. He said that he kept her alive for 3 days, but there was no way he could really confirm that because he had been using a lot of drugs at the time, so he wasn't entirely sure, what day he ended up getting rid of her. He did say that the time that he had her, which was at least a few days, he repeatedly sexually assaulted her. And when he wasn't doing that, he had her locked in the closet in his room. Now, this was highly upsetting for quite a handful of reasons, obviously. But one of the main ones for investigators was the fact that they had gone to the home on the 24th and the 25th. And based on what Couey was telling them, when they had gone to the home both of those times, Jesse was alive still inside that house, 65 yards away from her own home, locked in a closet. And even Couey said, quote, "For some reason, they came to my house, but they didn't come in and search. But I wish they would have because they would have found her, but they didn't." They had been this close and they totally missed her. From there, he said that on that third day, again, give or take some time, he began to panic because this was the point that they had brought out search dogs to track scents. They had really ramped up the police activity in the area. And so he was like, I have to get rid of her. But he said that he couldn't possibly do it with his bare hands. So he had to come up with a plan. So in the middle of the night, he ended up telling Jessie that he was going to take her back home. But instead, he had her climb out through his bedroom window and down that ladder. And he convinced her to hide inside of a trash bag. He explained this away by saying that he didn't want anybody to see her, and so she willingly got in. But instead of taking her over to her home just yards away, he knotted the trash bag above her head, put a second one on, knotted it below her, and dumped her into a pre-dug hole and buried her alive. Detectives could not at all believe what they were hearing. Somehow, in a home across the street, a home they visited multiple times, directly across from a 24-hour command center. I mean, they literally took photographs from the Lunsford home towards the trailer, and you could see that ladder that she had climbed apparently down days later. This man had hidden Jessie, repeatedly assaulted her, dug an entire hole in the ground, and buried her alive, and they missed it. And to top it off, multiple people had been living in the home with Couey as he held her hostage. None of this sounded like it was even possible. So on March 18th, Deputy Holder arrived at Couey's sister home on Snowbird and cordoned off the entire area for a possible recovery. With the assistance of many other experts, they decided to remove the wooden deck on the east side of the home. Tech Spittle came back out to the scene to process that much more and ended up finding that same ladder that had been leaned up against his window, now on the ground beside this porch, right beside a shovel with fresh dirt on the blade. So at this point, they began to dig, knowing that they very likely were going to find the remains of Jessie Lunsford. While the digging continued, FDLE analyst Stephen Stark began to process the inside of the home even more. They wanted to make sure that they had as much evidence as humanly possible. They took speaker wires from the home, samples of a blood stain in the closet, a wine box, a pizza box. They collected a large glass tabletop, and all of these items were immediately sent off to Tampa Lab for forensic testing. And then, unfortunately, after hours and hours of digging, at 4 a.m. on March 19th, the remains of Jessie Lunsford were in fact found. Just as Couey had said, Jessie had been placed into 2 trash bags. There were 2 of her fingers sticking out of the bag, showing signs that she had attempted to get herself free. And when the bags were ultimately opened, it was found that her wrists had been tied together with some sort of antenna cord or speaker wires, and her arms tightly. She was holding her purple stuffed dolphin. Following day, on March 20th, they again continued to process the home. Detective Martin and Detective Kennedy ended up removing the entire closet because he had told police in his confession that that is where he kept her. So they removed it entirely to process it for prints and hair and you name it. And meanwhile, an autopsy was being done by ME Stephen Cogswell. Now, he stated that she had very clearly stepped into these trash bags based on her positioning. So this aligned with what Couey had told investigators. They were able to also confirm sexual assault, and the cause of death was suffocation. They were able to say that she likely died within about 2 to 3 minutes, 5 minutes at the max. DNA testing results at this point started to come back, and it just continued to prove exactly what Citrus County investigators already knew at this point. The DNA testing from the mattress, the pillows, and the closet, all of the blood stains that were tested all came back as a positive match to Jessie. And one of the samples specifically that had been taken from the bed was a mixture of DNA that belonged to both Jessie and Couey, and this further proved sexual assault. Prints that they had taken from the closet all came back to Jessie as well. They found her thumbprint on the pizza box in the closet. They found Couey's fingerprints on the box as well. And again, both of their sets of prints were found on that glass tabletop that had been removed from the home. On March 21st, John Evander Couey was arrested and charged with burglary with battery, sexual battery, kidnapping, and murder. And he was not even the only one that was arrested. Police also ended up arresting all of those that were in the home because they believed they had some sort of information. So they arrested his sister, Dorothy Dixon, who was 47 years old at the time. His niece had also been living there, 27-year-old Maddie Secord. Dorothy's boyfriend, Matthew Dittrich, was also arrested. And from my understanding, Gene Secord, who was Maddie's husband, was also at least living at the home at the time. He was actually there on the 23rd into the 24th. He had already been arrested prior due to unrelated reasons. So everyone was taken into custody. These 4 adults had been in the home when Jesse was alive in this closet for potentially 3+ days. And while police could not say for sure at this point if they knew that she was there or knew that Couey was responsible for the abduction or knew that he was even responsible for her murder, they at least knew that these individuals had information that they had failed to tell police. So they were all arrested on obstruction charges. They had known that Couey was in Georgia. So the times when police had been looking for him, they knew where he was and were not telling authorities. On top of that, Dorothy was the one who had paid for his bus ticket, and Maddie was the one who bought it under her name because he didn't have an ID to buy the ticket himself. This entire situation was just frustrating because this little girl very likely could have been saved in so many different circumstances, but somehow everyone missed it. And this fact was eating away at the entire community. The community that searched for her, the sheriff's department, the FBI, and mainly Jesse's family. Imagine being that close the entire time. It was a lot. It was a lot for them to emotionally cope with and understand. The Lunsford family was already so hurt because the focus had been on them a lot of the investigation. Mark seemed to be the potential suspect for a good portion of the investigation, but despite the frustration, it seemed that they tried to be as understanding as possible. Ruth said, quote, "They knew they had never faced something like this before. Dossie was doing his very best." And on March 26, 2005, the Lunsford family held a memorial service for Jesse that was attended by so many people. This impacted the entire community. And not just that, like surrounding communities, the entire nation, everyone had been wondering where Jesse was. And this was not at all what anyone was expecting to be the outcome. Sheriff Dossie seemed to take this very hard as well. He said, quote, "I'm so sorry I didn't bring back hope to your lives," end quote. A memorial was also held in Ohio where her mother lived, and even that far away, over 300 people attended to support them as well. So this really goes to show how widespread this case was and how many people knew about it and how many people cared. But this was far from over. The prosecution was starting to work on their case, build it up as much as possible to ensure that this man did not have the chance to do this to anyone else ever again, while Mark essentially did the same thing in his own way. He began to travel the entire United States, lobbying for change. He wanted different laws, new legislation to hopefully prevent this from happening to anyone else, because no one could wrap their mind around the fact that there was this man that had repeatedly sexually assaulted children, that was freely walking along the streets, living in a neighborhood that was filled with children, had different regulations and laws been in place. And had he been monitored, this could be a completely different situation. So he began to push very hard for something that is now known as the Jessica Lunsford Act. So this act would essentially mean harsher punishment and stricter monitoring for sexual offenders and predators. And because at this point they were receiving like minimum sentences, pretty much no monitoring. On May 22nd, 2005, after a lot of work, Jeb Bush ended up signing the Jessica Lunsford Act into law in Florida. So as a more formal description of this particular law, and I will have it all linked down below, so if you want to read it in its entirety, you absolutely can. But this required sex offenders to report to the county sheriff's office not once, but twice a year to prove their place of residence. And I'm sure you're thinking, okay, well, that's like not really going to do anything. What if they decide not to show up? Felony. A felony is what happens if they decide to not show up. So Jessica Lunsford Act also would extend the time that offenders could petition to have their names removed. So originally it had been 20 years, and this pushed it back to 30 in my personal humble opinion, I think it should be longer than that, just because you never know. And if it's someone that's already a repeat offender, I don't think they should ever have the opportunity to take their name off. And in regards to monitoring, this act made it so electric monitoring was mandatory for certain offenders and predators that had a history of very specific offenses. Another very huge change in this act is something that I cannot believe was not in place prior to this, but it requires background screening for contract workers that would be granted access to schools. The fact that this was not a thing, like, absolutely boggles my mind. There's contract workers all the time at schools for a plethora of different reasons, and they have just as much easy access to children roaming the halls alone or roaming the grounds as anyone else. Probably one of the biggest and most extreme changes is that it mandates a 25-year minimum sentence and a maximum sentence of life in prison, even for first-time sex offenders. The hope was to completely stop repeat offenders, or just offenders in general, in their tracks. Now, obviously, that is not going to catch absolutely everybody, but I can almost guarantee it made a handful of people think twice. So this was an absolutely massive accomplishment, and I will get kind of more into that in a little while, but essentially that is now something that you see in almost every single state in the United States of America. But a year after this was passed and Mark was successful in lobbying for this change, the trial process began, and boy, was it a long one. So the very first thing, I'm talking right out of the gate, there was already a massive blow. On June 30th, 2006, Judge Rick Howard ended up completely throwing out the confession. Now, unfortunately, there were a handful of times throughout the entirety of this case, seemingly more so towards like the end and then while awaiting trial, where deputies didn't seem to fully follow through with protocols and procedures, and this was one of those times that they did not do that. So in the recording of the interrogation where Couey goes on to confess, this third big time that they are investigating into him and they are trying to get something out of him, he asked not once, but 8 times for an attorney. And for some unknown reason, he was not granted one. And so the detectives continued to question him and ultimately got a confession. Now, obviously, there were many other things within this confession that proved what he said was true. It did not seem like it was anything coerced. The location that he gave them, the information that he gave about how she would be found and the things that he did to her, like all of that stuff matched up. However, it is your right to have representation. And because he asked for it and was not given proper representation, they had to totally can this confession. So that was very unfortunate. However, the prosecution still felt that they had a solid case with or without it. But the reason that this was a difficult blow, more so than just the fact that, they obviously lost this confession, is inevitable discovery. So basically, the prosecution now had to prove that even without this confession, they would have ultimately found the remains of Jessie. And I was kind of nervous at first when I read that information, but it was proven multiple times that they would have eventually found her. There were actually a couple times in the days prior that detectives and different searchers had noticed a pile of leaves in that area where there was like fresh dirt sprinkled on top. So they had already kind of seen the location of where she had been buried. And eventually they would have likely checked it deeper. So the case went on, but that was still not even the only hurdle. Despite 20 plus weeks, I think it was like 21 and a half weeks exactly, of trying to find an impartial jury in Citrus County, they were unable to do so. There was not a single person that they were able to bring in all of that time that could say that they were not biased, which, given the amount of community effort, the amount of community outreach, the amount of searches that had been done, the amount of news, I am honestly not all too surprised, and I actually think it's kind of shocking that they even attempted to give it a go there in Citrus County. So on July 13th, 2006, the jury selection stopped, and on September the 12th, 2006, about a month later, they decided to move the trial to Miami. And this obviously pushed things back a bit. They had to rearrange, get everything transferred over. And so finally, February 12th, 2007, so we're talking like a few months later, jury selection began yet again. And on May 1st, the trial started. And the prosecution announced that they were going for the death penalty. And the defense had some pretty big claims. And this is something that they had been saying since the pretrial. This was something they had been trying to prove basically since he had been arrested. What they were trying to prove was that Couey was very mentally ill and cognitively impaired. They stated that his IQ technically put him under the legal limit of what is considered mentally handicapped, and so he should at the very least not be facing the death penalty. Like, that should immediately be taken off of the table, because according to a ruling by the Supreme Court in 2002, those that are mentally handicapped cannot face the death penalty because they cannot fully understand it. And the defense continuously, before the trial and during the trial, brought up experts to prove their point. So their claim was essentially that he had been deemed cognitively impaired from a very young age. He was in special education classes, which his family was able to confirm. And they said that a recent test that they had done, that Dr. Robert Berland had done, gave the result of an IQ of 64. And 70 is that legal limit, with 100 being average. And according to Dr. Berland, he believed that this was the result of a brain injury from John Couey essentially sniffing glue and gasoline, and likely from abuse that he had suffered at the hands of his stepfather. And all of this information was backed up by Dr. Wu, who was an expert at reading brain scans. Now, according to Dr. Wu, Couey's scans showed signs of psychosis, of poor impulse control, of a sexual nature, of aggression. Dr. Wu also pointed out that he had a temporal lobe abnormality. And so while all of this information is kind of flowing out, and it really is painting this picture that Couey is, cognitively impaired, he's not understanding what's going on. It's also creating this idea that he maybe didn't understand the crime that he was committing. There really didn't seem to be like absolute certainty of anything with these experts. From what I've seen, Dr. Berland said that there could be many different factors that could change the results of an IQ test. Dr. Wu had also stated that others with those types of scan results did not necessarily go on to commit murders. And the one thing that kind of ticked me off the most is that I think they were trying so hard to play into this that they had Couey act a certain way, which is so incredibly disrespectful. The big focus the entire time that he was at the trial was the fact that he sat there and was coloring like a child the entire time. And so I don't know what I went on to find out. That a bit of information ended up sticking out to me and pissed me off pretty bad. So when all this information came out, the prosecution immediately fought back. So they had expert Eric Cotton look at the scans, the same exact ones that Dr. Wu looked at, and he was able to point out there are absolutely no signs at all on the scan of temporal lobe abnormalities. He didn't even see any evidence whatsoever of brain damage at all. And to take it a step further, they did their digging, and there was actually no documentation whatsoever that Couey had ever been medically diagnosed as being cognitively impaired when he was a child. He had taken 6 IQ tests in his life from 73 to 2006. Only one of those ever was below 70, and conveniently, it was through Dr. Berland's testing. I believe the highest score that he ever got was 89, and majority of his scores were higher 70s to low 80s. So while Couey may have been what is considered, of lower intelligence, he was by no means cognitively impaired to the point that he didn't understand what he was doing and didn't understand the death penalty. And even more interesting to me is that Dr. Pritchard was brought on by the prosecution as well, and explained that the test that Dr. Berland used to get that low score was actually more geared towards academics, and it wasn't at all really relevant to the IQ and information they were really looking for. When a different test was administered that was more geared toward like social IQ and reasoning and all of that, that's when he ended up scoring a 76 with Dr. Pritchard. The prosecution was also able to bring forward multiple other witnesses that were able to corroborate this idea that there was no way that Couey was cognitively impaired. Multiple superiors of his, like employers, were able to come to the stand and confirm that he had been trusted and worked with chemicals, the mixing of chemicals. He was able to safely work with them and follow instructions. He frequently worked with heavy machinery. He basically did a lot of things that there's no way on earth he would have been able to do had he been as cognitively impaired as they were trying to state that he was, to a limit where he would receive different treatment during trial and sentencing. Even the judge had stated that if Couey had committed this crime, that the level of effort and thought it would have taken to successfully get Jessie out of the home quietly, to hide her successfully for days, there was just absolutely no way. So essentially that was all tossed out. And interestingly, even more information that it seems the defense tried to bring forward turned around to bite them in the butt. They did argue his background a lot, which was not a very good one. When he was a child, as I'd already mentioned, he was physically abused by his stepfather, ended up living with other family members, bouncing around different places who would either try to help him or would also cause him harm. But one thing that ended up being brought up during all this questioning was different family members that had claimed he had sexually assaulted them. One thing that was really upsetting is that he was in a very good circumstance at one point. There was one family member of his that actually was trying very hard to get him the help that he needed because he was displaying some, unusual behaviors. But unfortunately, he ended up kicked out of their home because he tried to sexually assault his cousin. So this just ended up bringing forward the fact that these tendencies had always been there, and I believe this happened when he was only 11 years old. Other witnesses took the stand at the trial, including everyone that had lived in the home on Snowbird and somehow missed Jessie being kept in that house for all of those days. So Dorothy, his sister, ended up telling the jury kind of the events of that day. She said that she was there with her boyfriend, Matt, and Couey, and they all went to a place that they referred to as the Yard because there was a guy they knew there who worked on diesel rigs. It was just a good place to hang out. So they spent majority of the afternoon into nighttime drinking, and she admitted to sharing a crack rock with Couey. So he was high on drugs at the time. And she said at around 1 a.m., that's when everyone turned in for the night, and she was in the room watching TV with her boyfriend and didn't hear anything at all odd throughout the night, didn't hear anyone coming and going, didn't hear someone in the house screaming for help, like nothing that you would imagine. Dorothy did state she remembered seeing all of the police activity in the neighborhood the following day, and she had in fact heard of Jessie's abduction, but she didn't really think much of it. And her boyfriend, Matt, essentially said the exact same statement. Now, Jean and Maddie Secord, her daughter and her daughter's husband, who also lived in the home, they claimed to have stayed at the home the entire night of the 23rd as well. They had a little 2-year-old at the time, so they decided to hang out at home, watch TV, and at around 9, they turned in for bed, and they also claimed that they had not heard or seen anything that night or the following days. Maddie confirmed that she gave the sheriff's deputies permission to search around the house on the 24th, so the day that the searches even started, and Jean also confirmed that on the 25th, police came back, and that was when Couey was in the home, and he remembered him stepping out back, but again, didn't think much of it. Everyone essentially said they hadn't seen or heard anything at all, except Jean did have one extra thing to add. So, as I stated before, everyone had been arrested, but Jean was already incarcerated at the time. So, in March 2005, when Couey ended up being arrested, he was thrown into a jail cell directly beside Jean, who was his nephew-in-law. And they apparently had conversations back and forth during their stay there, and Couey would talk a lot about religion. And then at one point, he started to speak to Jean about the abduction and murder of Jessie. And he essentially admitted to Jean that he had killed her, and basically said it was in the past now, and that if his sister had loved him more, he would not have done it. I have seen that the charges for all 4 of those individuals were ultimately dropped, and my assumption is that they dropped them in return for those testimonies. Now, many evidence experts also testified at the trial, apart from all of the experts that spoke on his, mental status. And one of those experts was Jerry, I think it's Carino or Serino, I'm not exactly sure which way it's pronounced. Basically, he was a expert in fracture matching. So when Jessie was found, as I've already told you, she was found with the cord wrapped around her wrists. And they were also able to find a very similar cord within the home. He was able to look at these cords and find that there were actually corresponding fractures, to the point that he was able to physically perfectly fit the 2 cords back together and confidently state that the 2 pieces had at one point been one. So while there had already been some evidence that was collected in terms of proving that Jessie was in the home, they did need something that indicated that he was involved in her murder, and that was really the biggest thing, because from my understanding, I don't know if they got much off of her remains, and I also don't think they were able to get anything off of the bag, as in like fingerprints or anything like that. They were able to find very similar trash bags within the home. All of them had Couey's fingerprints on them, but the bag itself that she had been wrapped in, there was nothing. So some controversial testimonies were also given during all of this, and this was one of the other main points that the defense really kept on trying to nail. The defense was like, all right, look, you're going to hear from some jail guards and you're going to hear from some detectives, and basically take what they say with a grain of salt, because they took advantage of Couey's mental state to essentially get information out of him. Interesting that they even tried to continue with that tactic, just because that was mainly supported by one of the original experts that claimed that his low IQ and the fact that he was cognitively impaired legally was that would cause him to be more prone to involuntarily giving statements. So regardless, these different people came forward, the multiple different jail guards, correctional officers, and all of them claimed that he essentially told them the same thing. Some claimed he said he didn't know why he killed Jessie. Others, he said that it was the drugs that got him to do it. Essentially, despite the fact that his original confession had been thrown out, according to these multiple people, he had continued to confess over and over and over again once he was finally arrested. But for some unknown reason, this is another one of those times where everyone messed up, and none of these officers put any of this information in their log. So while they were able to come and say what they heard, they were not able to back any of it up with any of their documentation from their time with Couey. So I feel like while that could have had a ton of weight, and despite the fact that they all said essentially the same exact things, without that documentation, it ended up not being as powerful as it possibly could have been. So
in the Circuit Court of the 11th Judicial Circuit of the State of Florida, in and for Miami-Dade County, change of venue from 5th Circuit, Citrus County. The State of Florida versus John Evander Couey, case number 2005 CF 298A. Verdict, count 1. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. The defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree of as charged in the indictment. So say we all, the 7th day of March, AD 2007, at Miami-Dade County, Florida. Pedro Yaguna, foreperson. Verdict, count 2. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. The defendant is guilty of burglary of a dwelling with a battery as charged in the indictment. Verdict, count 3. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. The defendant is guilty of kidnapping as charged in the indictment. So say we all, the verdict, count 4. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. The defendant is guilty of sexual battery on a child under 12 years of age as charged in the indictment. So say we all.
Madam Clerk, you may publish the recommendation.
In the Circuit Court of the 11th Judicial Circuit of the State of Florida, in and for Miami-Dade County, change of venue from the 5th Circuit, Citrus County. State of Florida versus John Evander Couey, case number 2005 CF 298. A majority of the jury, by a vote of 10-2, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon John Evander Couey for the murder of Jessica Marie Lunsford.
Immediately after this was suggested, his defense put in an appeal to the Supreme Court with the same exact argument that he was cognitively impaired. They were really, really determined to get this, which they did have that one score, but ultimately, and you can read the appeal and everything online, I have that link down below, the court was basically like, look, like, there is absolutely no evidence to support this. There's actually way more evidence to support that it is not at all the case. Your one score has absolutely no weight because it's in an area that we're not even necessarily worried about in terms of being able to commit a crime or not. So this was completely tossed to the side. And on August 24th, 2007, a few months later, Judge Rick Howard ultimately sentenced John Couey to death. And he went in on him when he handed down this sentence. He said, quote, "He caused a slow, suffering, conscious death. Her only source of comfort during this horrific experience was her purple dolphin. His actions crushed the very breath and life out of Jessica Marie Lunsford. His crime ended up also being considered especially heinous, obviously for reasons you can gather here, but also there were other reasons. He had allegedly made very vulgar statements to police after his arrest, even stating that the media was blowing things out of proportion. Because, quote, this kind of thing happens every day. I've also seen it claimed, and I don't think this ever actually made it to trial. I believe this was said during his confession that was thrown out. He allegedly justified his actions by saying that Jesse never fought back. So this was definitely someone that did not need to go back on the streets, that did not ever need to be in a position where he could potentially harm anybody else. But this ended up being a sentence that he would never make it to. Just within a few years, on September 30th, 2009, he died from cancer at age 51. According to the small bits of information that they released on this, he had already been sick for a very long time with, I believe, colon cancer. And ultimately, that is what he ended up passing away from in a hospital that the prison had sent him to. Now, this kind of took a lot of people off guard. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey said, quote, "I know he didn't suffer the way Jesse did when he killed her. I'm sorry I won't get to look him in the eyes as he died, but I'm relieved to know he'll never hurt another child again."
With me here is Mark Lunsford, the father of Jessica Lunsford. Mark, I've known you for quite a few years. For the first time, I could say I had a genuine smile from you today. What was your reaction?
Well, you know, it was a big surprise, most definitely. I got a call from the prison system. They wanted to let me know that John Couey was found dead in his cell, and the autopsy hadn't been done yet, but they would let me know as soon as it was. And it was just, you know, it was a little overwhelming. It made my day very exciting. You know, I don't know if exciting is the right word. Maybe I was just really pumped. I got on my bike, took off, and thought things through, and I realized that, okay, John Couey's dead, so what? There's still 600,000 more.
600,000 more sex offenders in the country.
In the United States. There's over 4 million people in the state of Florida trading child porn. But thank God to our governor and the programs that we have available to us. The state, 77 of those guys were caught. But yeah, I mean, you know, he's not a burden to the state anymore, and he's not something that I have to think about anymore.
Yeah, and so you're not thinking about him anymore, but it seems like it is a relief for you, though. It's a burden off your shoulders.
I think it would be to any family whoever caused them some kind of grief like this was to die before their actual sentencing date. Most definitely. It does take a lot off of you. I mean, because now you no longer have to think about his efforts for his next appeal or anything like that. Not that I had any doubt in the Florida system. I believe they'd have killed him, but there is that process called the process of appeals. I heard that he had an appeal and he was asking for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. I guess he got his answer, didn't he?
Since then, there has been continued efforts to make changes to legislation surrounding the sexual assault of children and just adults, anyone in general. And not only did the Jessica Lunsford Act end up changing Florida, but thanks to constant pressure from Mark and many other people supporting the cause, as of 2014, 45 other states ended up adopting their own version of this law. I know I have it here in North Carolina. I highly encourage you guys to look up and see kind of what the changes were in your state. I did try to check to see if that number has changed since then, and from what I have seen, it has not. So I don't know why the other states are not jumping on the bandwagon, but they really should. And according to everything that I've seen Mark state, no one is going to stop until every state has their own version. They're going to continue to push for these changes to happen because he essentially said that there's so much more that can be done. While this act has made so many positive changes, this is not a fight that is ever going to fully end. There are still ways that we can do things as a community and change as a community. There are things that we can do different as parents, in our healthcare system, within our prisons, within our police departments. There's so much that can change to help prevent children from becoming victims of this sort of crime. And it's never something that is just a one-stop solution. It's always something we're going to have to fight for. But the Jessica Lunsford Act was not the only thing that Mark or the Lunsfords or the officials in Citrus County accomplished. They all worked together to open the doors of what is known as Jesse's Place in 2008. Now, according to their website, I'm reading off of this, so if I'm staring down here, that's why. But according to their website, it's a child advocacy center where investigative efforts of law enforcement and DCF are coordinated and supported by the community. Abused and neglected children are given access to forensic interviews, medical exams, and they are guided in their journey with love and support. They provide therapy along with other advocacy services so that these children who otherwise have nowhere to go have a youth-based and centered facility to go and feel safe. And there's so many great points that have been made by Mark that have been things that I've never even really considered before or taken the time to think about. And it's the fact that our system right now is not built for children at all. We are basically hoping that children will go to an adult and ask for help, and that adult will make the right decision and take them to the next place, who will take them to the next place, who will take them to the next place. And hopefully someone who cares will end up in front of the child that's asking for help. But more times than not, they're ignored. They're bounced around to different agencies. And this is incredibly overwhelming and scary for these young children. And more often than not, you're going to totally discourage them from coming forward and speaking about anything that's going on with them. We're talking about children who already likely have this constant feeling of being a burden, or children that are always just on the edge of their seat waiting to be punished by adults. Heaven forbid they make one wrong move and they're going to be abused again, or heaven forbid they say one wrong thing and they are going to be kicked out of the house again. They saw this void and they decided to fill it. There needs to be an easy place, an uncomplicated way for children to get the help that they need, to be taken seriously in an environment that caters to them. And so this opens so many doors and helps to prevent further trauma. And honestly, I am all in support for it. And I hope that there has been a lot more expansion and places like this can be all over. There are lots of ways for you to personally help and support Jesse's Place. They could always use help with fundraising, special projects. You can volunteer. You can fill out an application to work there. There's also a donation wish list on their website, which I have linked down below. Things like baby wipes, hand sanitizer, paint, construction paper, hygiene products, you name it. They try to make sure that they have everything that they need to provide as much support to these children as possible. So if you are someone who wants to reach out and see the best ways in which you can help, or if you're local and want to drop off these things, that's definitely something that is awesome as well. It's very interesting in this case to see the transparency and honesty and the way that it kind of affected the sheriff's department, because I feel like that is not something that you often see. Most of the time when things get messed up, it's very easy for them to shrug that off and move right past it. But I feel like Dossie was very open about his shortcomings on the case and the things that he learned from it and the things that he will continue to do better. And that, to me, is the kind of law enforcement that we need to have in place. He has stated openly that it has shook him and his agency to their core, and it's something that he is never, ever going to forget. He stated, quote, "When you have a case like this, two things will happen. Either your career career will dissolve in front of your eyes, or you will continue moving forward. I was fortunate enough to continue moving forward. Since then, there has also been a documentary called Jesse's Dad, and that has been done to kind of show basically not just what happened to Jesse, but all of the things that came out of it. And it was a very kind of eye-opening moment seeing an interview with Mark about this particular documentary and him speaking about what it's like to see the documentary out there and have to watch it and all of these things. And I feel like he kind of put a great perspective into how I know I feel and many feel about the true crime world. It is never fun for anyone to talk about true crime. Seeing these documentaries and these videos on YouTube and things on TikTok and all of that. Yes, there's a lot of people who do not do it ethically. And that's something that I think every creator works on a daily basis to make sure they're doing things the best way that they possibly can. Choosing to take that reality and those ugly parts of the world, the realities of true crime, and shove them down to where no one knows about them, no one sees them. We can no longer learn from them, and it breeds, in my opinion, inaction and complacency. It's much easier to remain ignorant and pretend these things don't happen, when the reality is they do, and they could happen to anyone. In the end, we're all in this together on one level or another. We don't take the opportunity to recognize that and put our minds together to learn from these situations and figure out how we can continue to push forward and make this world a better place. There's no telling what could happen if we chose to just completely stop doing that. And a quote from Mark Lunsford directly about continuing to tell his daughter's story and help people be aware of the realities of what's going on and the punishments of these criminals and the laws that are out there to protect you or not protect you. It kind of says it all. He said, quote, "Every time I see the documentary, it's emotional, and I always walk away with one thought. You know, every time somebody sees this, somebody's going to do something. Somebody out there in the group of people that's watching it, they're going to do something," end quote. And I feel like that is the sentiment for majority of the true crime community. And hearing about these cases could push you to look into the different laws in your community. It could push you to look into the different cases similar in your community. See how these different things could potentially impact you or the people that you love. So with that being said, I hope that each and every one of you took something away from today's video. Maybe you've realized a few ways that you want to ensure that you and your children are safe. Maybe you're now going to go and create a file for your children and yourself for an If I Go Missing folder. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to the story of Jesse Lunsford. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Howlin' fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.